Okay, all right, I'll start. Okay, excuse me. Um, okay, well, hello everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm honored to be here, and Yuval, thank you again for inviting me. Um, Today we're going to talk about alliance, restructuring, and character change. And when Yuval and I were talking about what to talk about, we had some different ideas, and he really liked this idea of these three. And at first, I wasn't quite sure, why the three of them together or what the connection was exactly. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized he's really onto something with combining all three. Um, so hopefully we'll be able to tie that all together tonight or today. I'm going to start by giving a little talk on each of the three concepts and a little bit about what I think. But nothing I say is definitive. It's my opinion, and I want you guys to all feel free to disagree or agree, and we're going to have plenty of opportunity to open this up to discussion. And so, this is just what I think about it and what I put together. I have a bunch of notes, so I'm not resisting emotional closeness. I might need to check my notes a little bit. So let's start with alliance, okay? Because truly that is the foundation of everything in psychotherapy, really of any type of psychotherapy, whatever model or type you're doing. Without an alliance, you can't do anything. Now, what's unique in Istdp is that Davenlu broke up the alliance into these two parts: conscious alliance and unconscious therapeutic alliance, right? This is a quote from Davenlu that I'm gonna give. It's from his article on the case of the German architect. He says, the conscious component of this alliance consists of the patient's will to get well, to collaborate with the therapist, to tell the truth, even if it is painful, to face disturbing feelings. The unconscious component, that's what we all call the UTA, consists of the tendency to make communications that enable the therapist first to infer what is happening beneath the surface, and then to bring this into the open and enable the patient to experience it. If you know exactly what the difference between those two things are, maybe you can teach me, because to me it sounds a little vague. I get some of the idea behind it, but I think it's a bit gray, some of the areas in between the two. What I've heard people describe UTA in all kinds of ways. I always liked my former mentor, Patricia Coughlin, talks about it as a kind of innate healing force, or like an immune system within our emotional world, something that just is kind of striving for self-healing. That's one way to think about it. Recently I was thinking about this, and I wonder what you all think about this. If you think about the nature of psychodynamic therapy, one of the things we're trying to do is make what is unconscious conscious, right? So we're trying to take unconscious feelings and bring them into awareness, or unconscious thoughts and fantasies and bring them into awareness. Is the same true of unconscious therapeutic alliance? Are we trying to make the unconscious therapeutic alliance into a fully conscious therapeutic alliance? And that's a question. I don't necessarily have an answer, but it's just something to think about. Maybe you guys have seen the graph. It appears in Alan's book. It's I think originally a Davenlu graph. It appears in other articles and books on Istdp, where you see in a graphical layout how complex transference feelings, resistance, and UTA all rise in tandem. And at first, the resistance is higher, but it's stronger than the complex transference feelings or the unconscious therapeutic alliance. And at a certain point that we call the unlocking, the UTA gets higher than the resistance, and the complex transference feelings get higher than the resistance, right? They break free. So at that point, that the UTA is stronger than the resistance? Is UTA CTA? Is it conscious? Because the patient is then able to fully speak to all this. So these are just questions that I think are worth pondering. I don't have all the answers to them, but I think it's worth thinking about. Let's start in thinking about the alliance with the conscious alliance, okay? And again, I think it's fuzzy between exactly where that begins and or that ends and the UTA begins. But how do we activate the conscious alliance, okay? Well, in my opinion, we all have our own different ways of doing that. There's no one way and there's no prescription. And we all use all kinds of things that are just innate to our personality and who we are to kind of build an alliance. But here's some things that I've written down that I want to share with you that I think are important in building the Conscious Therapeutic Alliance, because truly the Conscious Therapeutic Alliance is equally important, I think, to the UTA. I mean, it's really where the start is having a Conscious Therapeutic Alliance. So here are some ideas. One, empathy for the person of the patient. So communication of real care and regard for the patient's suffering and a desire to help them. How we communicate that empathy, though, is personalized and it's different. You know, that's why you see different videos. Everyone has a different style. And we see the way that empathy is communicated is different and often unique. But there's got to be empathy. You know, one of the ways that I hear back from patients, from my patients, that they feel my empathy is my persistence. I hear that a lot from patients, that they value my persistence, that I don't give up. And they say, you know, I was ready to give up. I didn't think I was going to get there. I didn't think I knew how to get to my feelings. But you never gave up. Now, at the point that I'm being persistent and relentless, you know, I can be a tough cookie. I'm on their defenses and this and that. But they view it as empathic because they know that I'm believing in them, that I'm holding out hope, that I'm there. And so that's kind of one way. But there's so many different ways. But that just came to my mind. Another thing that bolsters alliance, transparency. Being clear and honest in our communications. If we don't know something, be honest and own it. You know, sometimes patients will ask us a question and we don't know. And maybe we get a little anxious that we don't know. But it's okay to not know. And it's actually really healthy to model that it's okay that you don't know. So I'll say, you know, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that if a patient asks me. And similarly, if you do know, don't equivocate. You know, so if a patient wants to argue with you about what anxiety is, and in this model, obviously, we take a really firm and authoritative stance about what anxiety is, don't equivocate. Don't get into an argument either, right? There's all kinds of ways to deactivate this and that, but don't go along with the idea that maybe anxiety is really something else and you don't know what it is. I think you stick to what you know and what you don't know. Alongside that, a willingness to be wrong. If we make a mistake, own it, okay? And that fosters trust, connection, and it really models emotional flexibility and a healthy way to deal with guilt. The other day, a patient told me that she was angry at me because I hadn't given her enough validation about what she was proud of. She had told me that, she had made some changes and she was really proud of them. And I thought that we had looked at it, but evidently not enough. Okay, she felt like I'd given it short shrift and moved on to something else. So I said, you know what, you're right. I'm sorry. Okay. And I think that was a corrective emotional experience. And I could see that I was wrong about it. And so I was happy to acknowledge it. Okay. Close tracking of the patient. So this is part of defense restructuring, which we're going to be talking about in more depth. But, when we're tracking people, and now you smile, Okay, and now your eyes are looking away. Now, obviously, there's pressure in that. It's a form of pressure because we're commenting on the nonverbals, and there's clarification in there as well, and that can stir up some negative feelings. But don't forget that it also stirs up positive feelings. I had this experience the other day with a patient where we were looking to her anger towards me, and we were in that phase where she wasn't fully in touch with it. And I was saying, how do you feel this anger towards me? And she was saying a few things, but not other. I said, okay, and now look, your jaw just tightened. You see your jaw just went like. She hadn't noticed it, but I could see the muscle. When your jaw tightens, you can see a little bit of the muscles kind of stick out. And I noticed it. Later, she told me how touched she was that I was paying such close attention to her. Okay. I don't think that was unique to me and her. I think patients value that, many. Okay. As much as they get angry about it, there's a part of them that says, whoa, this person's paying really close attention to me. And I like that. So that bolsters the alliance, including the conscious alliance. Confidence in ourselves and our approach. This is another thing that I hear from people is they say, well, you seemed like you really knew what you were doing and you really believed in it. All right. And I think that goes a long way. If you're not confident, if you're anxious about what you're doing, patients are going to pick up on that, and it's going to be harder for them to really open up and make themselves vulnerable. So whatever you do, doesn't matter if you're doing ICP or anything else, whatever you do, to have faith in yourself and confidence in yourself, I think that goes a long way in building the alliance. This next one takes a little while to explain. Establishing clarity as early as possible and throughout the process on the problem, task, and goals. Now, I learned this from Patricia Coughlin, again, my first mentor in Istdp. She talks about it a lot. But what I want to say about it is I just think this is so important, and it really, really changes things from a kind of weak alliance to a strong alliance. So obviously when patients come in, depending on where they are psychodiagnostically, how syntonic their resistance is, they can have greater or lesser ability to declare why they're there. Okay, we start with some sort of question about why you're here, what are the problems that you're having, and some people are able to declare it really clearly, and for the rest of people it's a struggle. Okay, and I'm not going to, it's beyond this talk to get into kind of how you deal with that, and there's so many ways and different presentations, but obviously one of the first things we're doing in Istdp in a trial therapy is trying to get people clear on what the problems are that they want help with. Okay, and everyone just hold off on the chats for now, just and we'll have plenty of time. So getting clarity on the problem. Now, the goal. Oftentimes we think of the goal as not having the problem. Well, that's part of it, okay? But then, we also want to think of goals bigger than that. How much can they hope? What can they see in their future, even beyond? Is just not being depressed the only thing? Is that good enough to not be depressed? Right? Do they not want to be happy or this or that, to have more in their life? So really trying to not just get to not having a problem, but what are the goals? Okay, pretty straightforward, although very difficult to get there. The task, that's the hardest thing. Because what is the task but getting buy-in on doing Istdp therapy? I mean, that's really what we're talking about. Is the task as we see it is to do the treatment. How do we get buy-in? These people haven't read any books by Davenlu or Allen or anyone else. They don't know. We're not here to explain that to them. So then how can they really agree to the task? It's very complicated. So what I think is that from the beginning, we're trying to build a case for them, for what we are doing with them as being the road to their freedom. And we can't just tell them, well, just do this, it's going to be good. That's not, we don't want compliance. So what we really have to do is start to work with them very closely on getting a deep understanding of the corners of the triangle of conflict very early on. We want them to see that the way they are getting anxious and resisting their feelings is a major contributor, if not the cause of their problems. But that is really kind of straightforward to us because we live and breathe this and we're training in it. But we can't underestimate how foreign that is for most human beings. And I think a mistake we often make is we go too quickly with that. We kind of point it out, like, oh, you see how you got anxious when I asked you about your anger. Oh, so clearly, okay, so you get it now, right? You get now that everything is about how you're anxious about your feelings. It's like, no, slow down. They don't get it. They just are starting to open up and get it. Okay. So, so much of this is part of the restructuring process, but where we're going over and over and over the corners of the triangle of conflict, getting them able to see every aspect of their resistance, getting them to see all the aspects of their anxiety, their defenses, to see what it's costing them, to really, really look at it. So, one thing that has been an enormous interest clinically and academically for me is syntonicity. So that's when defenses are kind of somewhat invisible to the patient. And, we tend to think about this is a syntonic patient or that's a syntonic patient. I think that's a misguided way of looking at things. I think almost every patient has some element of syntonicity around at least some aspect of their resistance. Not to say everyone's syntonic, period, case closed, but everyone has some areas of invisibility, right? If they truly understood everything, they really wouldn't need our help. So we always want to be careful that the patient is tracking us, right? We tend to think of tracking as we're tracking them, but Davanu talked about tracking as mutual. Is the patient tracking us? I tend to say a lot, if you see my tapes, you'll hear me say a lot of things like, are you following me? Do you know what I mean? Do you understand what I'm saying? Do you get it or you don't get it? So I'm frequently checking in. Do they really know? And if I get the sense it's a compliant patient, what do you see? What are you seeing right now? Because I don't want them to just say yes, 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 right? So making sure that they're tracking you, because the patient needs to understand what you're doing and why you're doing it and how it relates to their goals. If they don't, you're going to lose them. So that's a major, major piece of establishing a conscious alliance. And one of the reasons that I get concerned when I see trainees tapes where there's relentless pressure to feeling early on, because I'm looking at the patient and I'm saying, they don't really understand why they're being asked this question. They don't really understand why they need to get to their feelings. And so, that early work where you're helping them see and understand all of the different mechanisms at play in their unconscious and their conscious, that sets you up so you can do the more relentless work. Okay. Head-on collisions. I won't get too technical in this talk, I promise, although I could. Just to say that, a lot of people get scared about head-on collisions. And I'd say, this is an area that everyone, do your best, put all your efforts into overcoming your fears, because you can't, in my opinion, do Istdp without the head-on collisions. The head-on collisions, Dalvanu said that they were the maximum form of challenge. I massively disagree. I think if you really look at the interventions within head-on collision, and there's up to 16 modules, composing the head-on collision, that many of them are actually pressure. Many of them are clarification, and they structure the entire process Okay, so the use, I use head-on collisions frequently, more even than I use outright challenge, because I think they're clarifying and I think they're deactivating. They put the emphasis on the patient's responsibility and the patient's will. And those are the kinds of things that boost the alliance. Okay. The more we can structure the process, the more we can help clarify, the more the alliance can take hold, including the conscious alliance. This goes along, this is the last thing I'll say about the conscious alliance. It goes along with what I've been saying, but I really think that part of what we're doing is we're building a case. We're building a narrative with the patients for what we're doing and why, and how their problems came to be, and how that relates to what we're doing at any given moment in the session. And I want to make sure that what I'm talking about with the patient feels like that makes sense from a narrative perspective. Like, how did we get here? Not just like inserting this kind of mechanistic questioning or repetitive questioning in the middle of a session. It's like, well, how did we get there? If you read Davnu's transcripts, it's a narrative. It flows. Everything the patient says, he has a response that matches, so the patient follows and tracks. And I want to make sure that I'm doing the same thing too, right? So the patient's not like bewildered, like, well, how did we get here, right? So you're building a case for what you're doing and why. Let me pause here, okay? I've plenty more to talk about, but I think this is a good place. Let's get your guys' thoughts about how you build a conscious alliance, what you think about the conscious alliance, etc. Feel free to disagree with anything I said. Since you're moderating, I don't know what you want to do. People could raise their hand. There were some.
Yeah, people can raise their hand. Sure, or unmute also.
Okay. And do you want to be the moderator, or should I just do that? I'll do it.
Yeah, or you want me to do it? So it's
no, I can do it. I can do it. Okay, so let's hear from you. Thoughts, questions, comments?
Jonathan, I like the way that you rephrase the pressure as kind of a pressure to emotional closeness, that you're really following and tracking them. So I really appreciate that perspective that you just mentioned. That gives a lot of clarity for me.
Yeah.
I'm getting more able to pressure the client a little bit more. So thanks.
Yeah, you're welcome, for sure.
I really appreciate that idea of using HOCs, perhaps even more than challenges, because they give so much more. I really like that idea. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And they're so structuring and clarifying. Outright challenge, if you're not judicious with it, it can alienate the patient.
Yeah.
And so you got to be really judicious about your use of it. Whereas, the head-on collisions, when used appropriately, really cement the alliance in a nice way.
I love that. Thank you.
Yeah. Other thoughts, other questions?
Julie.
Yeah. I think sometimes I still confuse the task and the goal. I think in my head, the task is the goal. Can you just say maybe a little more to help me really distinguish and how to explain it to clients?
Sure. So let's say the person has depression, that's the problem. And then, their goal is not only to not be depressed, but they want to be happy and they want to have better relationships in their life and to not be so withdrawn and isolated. Okay, et cetera. Those are the goals. The task is, how do you get there? So then part of what the case that you build with them over the course of that trial therapy is to see that they're getting depressed because they're internalizing. They have a depressive mechanism where they're managing their, let's say, their anger. It doesn't have to be, but let's just say that they're managing their anger by internalizing and putting back on themselves. All right. And then they also have, let's say, massive guilt about that. And it's leading to very kind of punitive superego, or what Davin called the perpetrator of the unconscious. So what you need to do, the task, is to kind of help them separate out the genuine feelings from these defense mechanisms, and the anxiety, and to get in touch with those feelings and then work through that, and then also look through their unconscious so you can see what caused this in the first place. How did they get this depressive mechanism, right? What kind of problem were they trying to solve by developing these symptoms? Because it's not enough just to feel your feelings. You also want to get to the unconscious, work through all the old conflicts. There's as Patricia likes to talk about, multiple causality, multiple reasons that people develop these. So those are the tasks to work through all that.
Okay.
Yeah, right.
Stella.
Yeah.
Hi. Well, thank you for this very concise presentation. It's very helpful to just have bullet points. And while listening to you, like in the back of my mind, I keep hearing, okay, that goes, but what if we're dealing with fragility? Yes, pressure, but what if there is fragility? And how do I know heads-on collision, right? But I can't do it if there is fragility. I'm going to lose the alliance. And not lose the alliance, but gonna lose the client, and the client is gonna be in a bad state if I do this, if there is this fragility. So how do I know I can already go there, not go there? Like it's a constant.
Right. Great question. So let me I might have been too quick to go into technical stuff. I'm not saying go out there and head-on collide with everyone. I'm saying you've got to obviously follow the central dynamic sequence, and the central dynamic sequence is different for every patient and certainly different for psychodiagnosis. I'm also talking about once you're there, kind of, once you're at that place. And, you can use head-on collisions with fragile patients, by the way. I'm not sure where that comes from that you can't. You can. You have to be very judicious about it. And you certainly don't want to use long-range ones, because a problem with using long-range head-on collisions with fragile patients is they have a tendency to feel like you're reprimanding them, that you're kind of an authoritarian parent who's telling them that they're bad, and you don't want that. So you got to be very careful about not using long ones, but you can certainly use some short range ones. But yeah, I'm not saying this is what you should do technically. I'm just saying head-on collisions are an important piece of building the alliance with any patient group, I think, but obviously psychodiagnosis is going to determine exactly how you do that. Yeah. So these are more general comments. Yeah. Anita. Good to see you again, by the way, Anita. Oh, I think you're on mute. Sure.
Sorry, I touched something. Good to see you, Jonathan.
Yes.
So one of your last comments around clarifying goals and tasks is that it's not, for example, it's not enough to feel your feelings, but you need to understand what problem they're trying to solve. Can you clarify that, please?
Oh yeah, sure.
Like
what I mean is, what I mean is that Davamu, excuse me, was really clear in his writings that the experience of complex transference feelings is the mechanism that unlocks the unconscious, but it's not the be-all, end-all. So once the person has experienced their complex transference feelings, if they've done it to enough of an extent, and they also, and this is very important, if you've exhausted the resistance enough, then there should be linkage to their unconscious figures, often in the form of a spontaneous transfer of imagery, and an opening of the unconscious, where then you're able to do dynamic therapy and get to all their unconscious conflicts. Some of them are about guilt over murderous rage, but not all of them, right? There's all kinds of things going on in the unconscious. There's all kinds of pockets of grief, pathological mourning. There can be conflicts around sexual feelings. There's, you name it. So that's where you do all the work that helps the patient see not only have they been resisting their feelings, but these are all the reasons why, and these are all the conflicts inside of them. That's what I meant.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions, or should I go on?
That's
Okay,
all.
I'm going to go. Sorry, did someone else?
No.
Go? No? Okay. All right. So I'm going to get a little technical in this next section, but, you know, always with the technical stuff, it's, you know, case by case basis and generalities I'm going to talk about. Okay. Okay. So how do we activate the unconscious therapeutic alliance? Okay. So for many of you, you'll know this, but I'm just going to kind of say, well, we try to mobilize complex transference feelings, which in turn mobilizes the resistance, and then we press on the resistance. Okay, we put pressure on the resistance, which then further increases complex transference feelings and further increases the resistance. And eventually, this also activates the unconscious therapeutic alliance, which then comes on board to help us battle the resistance. Okay, these three things, the UTA, the resistance, and the complex transference feelings, are what Davanu called the triple factors. So how do we do this? And this is a really brief kind of overview. Obviously, this is the whole process of Istdp. But so we use pressure from the beginning, and pressure, there's all kinds, as you know. There's pressure in being specific, like what are the problems? Okay, but that's vague. Can you tell me what the problem is? You know, so pressure to specificity, pressure to task, pressure to feeling. There's all kinds of pressure. The use of pressure begins to mobilize complex transference feelings, and immediately along with it mobilizes resistance. Just the two of those, the feelings and the resistance, are called the twin factors. Once you add the UTA, it's called the triple factors. So then we apply further pressure on the resistance, complex transference feeling rises, the UTA rises. The resistance now moves into the transference. So it's a transference phenomenon. We integrate challenge, head-on collision, resistance rises even more, right? It's now a full-blown transference resistance proper. And again, this is a kind of standard procedure. I'm not talking about the graded or anything else like that. So in a sense, all of the unconscious, the complex feelings, the resistance, the UTA, are getting mobilized together like in a soup, okay? And if we're able to achieve an unlocking of the unconscious, the UTA becomes dominant over the resistance. The complex transference feelings break through, the unconscious opens. This is a great quote from Joan Whittemore. If you have the opportunity to read any of her articles, I'd highly encourage you to. She writes just about as brilliantly and beautifully about Istdp as anyone. This is the quote. The unconscious therapeutic alliance is an unconscious dynamic force present in all patients, but which is usually not in operation in complex patients with powerful enough resistance to paralyze or dominate it. Through the power of the technique, via pressure and challenge and head-on collision, the rise in the transference and crystallization of the patient's character resistance in the transference empower the forces of the UTA to battle against the forces of the resistance until the position of dominance is reversed, and now the UTA is stronger than the resistance. The emergence of the UTA completes what Davanu refers to as the triple forces of the unconscious, all of which have been mobilized by the application of pressure and challenge and head-on collision. The implementation of technique and the ultimate success of the Istdp clinician depends wholly on his or her or their ability to orchestrate these forces in such a way as to trigger the breakthrough or unlocking of the unconscious. So this is her kind of rather pithy, I think, very concise explanation of what happens in Istdp that mobilizes that UTA. It's through the application of these techniques, pressure, challenge, head-on collision, that those triple forces get activated. Okay, let me, chat. Okay, so that's the alliance, the conscious and the unconscious alliance. Let's talk about restructuring. So restructuring is an umbrella concept, okay? It's a very broad concept that really refers to any of the various techniques that we use to bring what Davanu called multidimensional structural change to the unconscious. Okay, it's very often associated with the graded application of Istdp, but in truth, we do restructuring in like all Istdp. Even in the standard method, there's some element of restructuring going on because no one really comes in and has absolute clarity on the corners of the triangle of conflict and exactly why they have their problems and all of that. So there's always some element of restructuring, whether we're doing a graded approach or not. It's just the relative emphasis and how much of it we're doing. Why do we do it? Well, we can't get an unlocking of the unconscious unless certain structural capacities and structural differentiations are in place. For example, you cannot get an unlocking of the unconscious as long as the patient is not crystal clear on the differentiation between the three corners of the triangle of conflict. This is something I see people really often underemphasize, is getting absolute crystal clarity on what is the difference between their defenses, their anxiety, and their feelings. And you don't want to rush that. One thing I'm always working on with trainees is take the pressure off yourself to get the unlocking. All right. I know all the fireworks and the videos that draws people to Istdp, but really, really solid restructuring will change a person's life. And it's the prerequisite anyways to getting the breakthrough. And it's hard. The restructuring is hard. So, that's really where I think we should be focusing on in terms of bolstering our skill set. So what does that mean? What are some of the multidimensional structural changes that we, try to achieve? For fragile patients, obviously we're restructuring at the level of anxiety and often also at the level of defense too. So this is the other thing. When we think of restructuring, we tend to think of anxiety, but actually there's different stations where we restructure. Anxiety is one of them. So clearly if patients have anxiety that goes to CPD or smooth muscle, we have to restructure that and get them to the point where they can tolerate anxiety as a striated muscle phenomenon. Similarly, with fragile patients or other patients might not be fragile, but rely on regressive defenses, we restructure at the station of defense. So we try to take regressive defenses and make them more mature or adaptive defenses. Okay, that's a different type of restructuring, but it's at a different station. We're also restructuring in a way by bringing greater ego adaptive capacity or ego observing capacity, that the person's able to see themselves. You might think of that also, in terms of syntonicity. Now, syntonic patients need a ton of restructuring, but they don't need anxiety regulation, not unless they also have a problem with anxiety or, either low anxiety tolerance or some fragility, but they need a ton of restructuring at the level of defense. So you're doing restructuring, but focused on all of their defenses. Now, when we restructure, we use pressure. We apply pressure on the defense. Okay, let me give you an example. I talked about this in another talk that I gave recently, pressure on defense. So let's say that, you're talking with someone and they say that they are tuning you out. This happened with a patient of mine. It happens with plenty of patients, right? And they kind of acknowledge that they're disconnected, okay? And so there's some different things you could do, right? One thing would be to go to pressure to feeling. Okay, well, what do you feel towards me that you're disconnecting? Okay, that's fine. That's valid. It's legit. If you had enough of crystallization in the defenses at that point, you could even do a short range head-on collision. Okay, well, what's going to happen here if you keep disconnecting every time I ask you to look at something? Okay, also valid. Another thing would be to put pressure on the defense. Tell me about this part of you that comes here and asks for my help, but then disconnects every time I ask you to look inward. Tell me about it. How do you understand that? It's applying pressure, but it's directly on the resistance. It's on the defense. So, this is an element of the restructuring. And, in a way, you're working with any kind of syntonic aspect of the defense at that point. You're drawing it out. You're increasing their awareness of it. You're trying to get a sense of their will. Do they actually love their defense and they want to keep it? Or are they happy to work with you on getting rid of it? We tend to go really quickly into thinking that once we've identified a defense and the patient sees that it's blocking their feeling, they're going to want to get rid of it. Patients love their defenses very often. And, there's different levels of that, but you don't want to push them to give something up if you haven't worked with them to understand that actually they value it. They're seeing it as something that's supporting them in some way. So you don't want to be the authority figure coming in and forcing them to give that up. So you apply pressure on the defense and use lots of clarification to work through the defense and any thorniness around it. Okay, so that would be a major element of restructuring defense. Everyone talks about restructuring anxiety, so I don't think I'll add anything to the conversation in talking about how to restructure anxiety. We know how to regulate, and the only thing I'll say there with restructuring is sometimes I get the sense that people get scared about working with anxiety, going over threshold, and they take pressure off completely. But oftentimes you can twin anxiety regulation and pressure and clarification. So you can, because anxiety, if you think about it, anxiety is part of the resistance. Okay. Anxiety is a symptom that is functioning to block people's awareness of underlying feelings. So it's technically part of the resistance, and it can function as either a symptom or as a more pure defense, but it has a function as part of the resistance. So you can say, but again, a third time now, do you notice that your mind went blank when I asked you to look at this? Okay, bring the anxiety down. Can we look at that? The 3 times now you go blank when I ask you about that. All right, so you're still doing the anxiety regulation, you're still working the corners of the triangle, but there's pressure that's being kept up. So you're not letting the process go flat. Okay. Restructuring is part of building the alliance. How are they related? Well, think about it. One is, as I was saying, the process of restructuring someone is inherently salutary. It's inherently helpful to them in healing. So anything you can do to help the patient is going to build the alliance, right? Anything that you do that gives them a benefit is going to give them more buy-in into the treatment. Further, part of what we're doing with restructuring is helping people achieve greater clarity about themselves, greater clarity about what's going on inside of them, and also greater clarity about what we're doing together and why. So those are all the things that I mentioned earlier, build conscious alliance. So restructuring is a massive boon to building alliance. And the more you restructure, the stronger the alliance you get. Also, because there's pressure involved, if you're doing it in that way where you're keeping up the pressure, obviously it mobilizes feelings, mobilizes resistance, and mobilizes the UTA too. So restructuring goes hand in hand with alliance. Let me pause there. Let's get your thoughts on restructuring, how it relates to alliance or not, or anything.
I have a question.
Please.
It's been so helpful. I mean, so much clarity in the teaching. I really appreciate it. When I think about putting pressure on defense, I often have trouble because I'm trying to identify the defense and then how to put pressure by doing something different. So the client's being vague, I'm then asking them to be specific. But the way you're speaking about it is just kind of bringing it out into the open. Like, tell me more about this part of you that remains vague, right? Like, so that's how you're restructuring, is just sort of asking them to share more about that aspect of themselves in order to bring it into the work and then clarify it. Is that sort of, am I understanding that right?
Well, I think so. What I would say is that's part of it. Okay, that's part of it. It's not everything. But if you one of the things that I'll be talking about with my co-authors, Mikkel Rare-Longberg and John Rathhauser in this book, this long gestating book that we're working on that should be out hopefully soon, is again this concept of syntonicity and how I think it's underemphasized, that almost all patients have some level of lack of awareness of what's really going on for them. And I think we can underestimate that when it comes to defense work, that we're often too eager to press people to give up the defense before we've really helped them to identify whether they truly understand the defense, understand the function, and whether their will is fully on board with giving it up. So that question that I was asking, or similar type questions, would be trying to draw out how they understand the defense, what they understand in terms of the value that it's bringing to them, whether they understand that it's damaging to their life, okay, which should hopefully start to enhance their will to relinquish it. Because I don't want to be in the position of putting pressure on someone to get rid of something that half of them says, oh man, I need this to survive. Because when I was a kid, if I didn't do this, I was faced with overwhelming pain. Okay. And that might be unconscious. All right. But I don't want to be then the person who's putting pressure on them prematurely to give it up. I want to know that they see it, that they look at it, and that they actually are wrestling with how destructive it is, with the fact that there seems to be a part of them that's clinging to it. What's that about? Right? I want them to understand it. And then and only then am I going to really apply maximum pressure on them to give it up. But the secret there is, you again don't want the process to go flat. So you don't just say, tell me about it, and then like let it just 10 minutes of intellectualizing about the defense. You don't want that either. Okay, so you keep up the pressure while you're doing it. And for example, in the way that I asked it, it kept up the pressure because I highlighted the division within them. I said, well, tell me how you come to me for help, but then you tune me out. Right? So there's inherent pressure there. I'm inviting them, but I'm also applying pressure because I'm getting them to see, by the nature of how I asked it, that it's inherently self-destructive. And I'll draw that out even more as we go on. As opposed to, yeah, tell me about this part. Now sometime I might say something like that, but I want to make sure that I'm keeping a rise up, that I'm keeping the pressure on, along with clarification.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other thoughts or questions?
Yeah, we have a hand.
Oh, yes. Asin, isn't?
Yes, I wanted to ask you, you said unconstructing is some kind of umbrella concept. I didn't understand, what does this mean?
Oh, yeah. I just mean that restructuring is a very broad term. It's not just like this is one thing, restructuring is this. It's all the set of techniques and things that we do to help bring multidimensional structural change to the person's mental life, basically, to their unconscious and conscious functioning. So there's a lot of things that fall under the concept of restructuring. That's all I meant.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so let me, I have one last thing to talk about, which is the character chain. And then
Maybe
I think
we take one more from
sure.
another handout. So
Yeah.
you can unmute yourself. Mia.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. I had a quick comment to make. I loved what you were saying about making sure that the patient has fully, that it's not syntonic anymore, basically, that they're able to be like, oh, wow, this is really happening. And I was thinking about a conversation that I had with Ange Cooper where we were talking about will. And she was talking about reading Davenlou's cases and how, like, her take on it was that before he applies pressure, he's always made sure that the person, has owned that they're doing it. Like, do you see you're doing this right now? And that there's no pressure until you person is like, oh, I am doing that. And it makes so much sense, because it's like, how could someone really turn against something or even know that they have the choice or the will until they're like, I am doing this thing. It's not just happening, but I am doing it. I'm putting up this defense. So anyways, it just reminded me of that.
Yeah. Yeah. Also nice to see you, May.
Nice to see you too. I'm happy to be
So listen, that's a great point, and a good example of it, I think, where you see this a lot clinically, is you'll be working with a patient and you're trying to pin them down that they're doing some defense. And you're trying to say to them, clearly there's a major party that doesn't want to look to your feelings right now. And then they keep saying, no, I do want to. Have you guys run into that, where you're working with a patient and you're like seeing these defenses, but then they're like a broken record over and over saying, no, I want to, I want to, I want to. And Yuval says every day, right. Now, in terms of what you're saying, May, making sure that a patient owns it. So what you don't want is to just let the patient get away with that and say, okay, you want to, so then let's see how you feel. No, because they're basically taking a position of being blind to themselves in that moment, and they're not owning it. So you say, you say you want to, but I'm looking at you and I see how your eyes are on the ground. You keep going away with your thoughts. Every time I ask you to give a feeling, you go to a non-feeling. I'm saying this is not a man who wants to look at his feelings. Clearly, this is a man who wants to stay blind to what he's feeling. Okay, so this would be an example of trying to make them, do you see this? Do you see what I'm saying? Or maybe you don't see what I'm saying. Okay, so you don't just want to let them go compliant, because that's what they're doing when they say I want, is they're being compliant with you. They're not recognizing that there's a major part of them that doesn't, and you can't just go along with that, because then you get into a battle, right? Because then they think, oh, I want to. You keep, applying pressure on my defenses. It's an external conflict. You want it to be an internal conflict. They need to see that a part of them wants to and a part of them does. So you say, okay, you want to give up the defense, you're saying, and that's true, but how about we look at this honestly and see that another party really doesn't want to give this up? And you just leave it there. And you see what they do with that. Because there are some patients who get it, and they get their internal conflict, but a lot of patients want to disown and disavow the internal conflict. And that can get sticky, because when they disavow the internal conflict, you could head towards an external battle with them. So that's why you've got to, try to work that. Here's a question. What if the client says, I want to, but I don't know how? Well, so that's going to depend. There's so many different, questions there. So, one is, have you dealt with this defense before? Right? Because obviously the first time you're dealing with the defense, you want to help clarify it. So do you notice how quickly you go to this I don't know position? Do you know, is that something that you just do with me, or is that something that you do out there too? Right? So you're going to go slower in the beginning, but if you've clarified it and put pressure on it 20 times, or you're in your 10th session with the person and, you've been working on this, I don't know, then you can just outright challenge it. Again, you go to a helpless position, right? If you remain, now this is actually, so this is the article, we'll get into the corporate lawyer. She goes to the I don't know position, and Davanu says, if you remain here helpless with me to see how you felt, then I'm not going to be able to help you, and this process will end in failure. So that would be kind of the ultimate of what you do if they go to the I don't know position. But you got to get there incrementally. You wouldn't start there, right? First, you try to clarify and help them to see that I don't know is a defense, right? Okay. Okay. Last thing I'll say, and then we'll open it up, even more, is just about character change. Well, that's also broad, and it's a very ambitious goal, obviously, with an Istdp treatment. when we're talking about character change in this context, we're really talking about shifting a person's characteristic or habitual way of interacting with others and with themselves. In my opinion, the main focus is really on changing the way that rigid and often self-defeating defense mechanisms have infused the person's personality or character, and also how their personality comes across to others. It's inherently relational. A major aspect of creating that character change is the restructuring work. Okay, because that's really where we're getting into the nitty-gritty of the defenses and restructuring and shifting them, including those character defenses. Now, Mikkel Rehr-Longberg, who's my co-author and colleague, as I've mentioned, he's come up with a differentiation between character defenses, which is a more kind of broad term about these types of defenses that can infuse a person's personality, and what he calls characterological defenses, which are not just kind of minute acts, but actually what he calls defensive attitudes, obstructing the patient's emotional investment and presence in his relationships to himself and others. So it's just like a whole attitude. You can see like someone's whole attitude is that they're detached or arrogant or sarcastic, right? Aspects of them are passive. It goes beyond just one kind of defense. So obviously we got to use all of the techniques at our disposal for highly entrenched character defenses. And, this is really some of the hardest work in Istdp is shifting these character defenses. And again, I think what's important is not just getting to feelings, but helping them to see every aspect of these character defenses, why they do it, why they've been wedded to them, why they've been doing them so habitually, that there's a major part of them that's been reluctant to give them up or to even see them, and then where they came from, like what are the early conflicts and traumas that led them to develop these characterological ways of being with the world. Okay, let me stop there. That's enough of my spiel. And we'll take questions, open it up, and just get into the case, as well as I know you guys sent in some questions ahead of time. Anyone want to say anything about any of this before we get into the case?
Yep.
Okay.
I got a question.
Yeah.
Which defense do you had the most difficulty when you were studying and when you were kind of getting the grips of Istdp?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, as people who have maybe seen my work before, or my webinars or interviews I've given, I paid a lot of attention to defiance and compliance, excuse me, which I think are really, really underseen and very important defenses. And I'm happy to talk about that here if anyone has some specific questions. But what Davanu said is the killer defense is externalization. Externalization really is the killer defense, because if you think about it, when the person is externalizing, they don't have a problem. You have a problem, or their wife has a problem, or their boss has a problem. And if you cannot overcome that, you can't do therapy. There's just nothing to work on. And externalization is also terribly destructive to relationships, because the non-fancy way of framing externalization is blame. It's blame. So blame destroys relationships. So people who externalize are blamers. And that's going to be, majorly damaging to the therapeutic relationship. It's going to be damaging to all their other relationships. So that's in many ways the trickiest defense.
Can I ask a follow-up question on that?
Please.
How do you work with patients who have very good reasons to blame their parents or their loved ones? How do you get back the internal focus on how they contribute to the problem?
It's a great question. I don't have a kind of single answer because, again, this is so complex and there's so many patient presentations and different things. And also you want to know where you're at in the process. Obviously, if it's starting in the beginning, where you're asking them kind of, why are you here? How can I help you? And they start out and they're like, oh, my wife says this, or my wife, then you can't even start, really. I mean, the whole process then goes to, can you shift from an externalized position to an internal awareness? And if you can't, and some people you really can't, you can't do therapy. But that's different than if you're looking at I had this one guy and, we did a lot of great work, but he did have a part of him that was really wedded to seeing his parents as really responsible for his problems. And he didn't want to give up that blaming part of him. And that was tricky, and that really required a lot. It wasn't just like a single clever intervention. It was like the number of sessions and weeks and things to work through that. So it really depends on kind of where you're at and where you're at in the process. There's so much to it, Yeah.
Jonathan, I just love the way you emphasize throughout all you're speaking about that inner conflict all the time. You're not just presenting a pressure, you're presenting the pressure with the link to that inner conflict. I'm recognizing how much that is part of your very approach. I love it. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yeah. And thankfully all of my mentors and have emphasized that too, so I learned it from them. But yeah, absolutely. So much of, there's this one line that always stuck out for me in so many lines do, but one that I always return to whenever I find myself getting destabilized in the work. And it also appears in the article on the case of the German architect with Davlin says some version of, you can't let the patient make their problem your problem, because that's what they want to do. Okay, especially when you're talking about more highly resistant or more complex patients, is you're getting into all kinds of need to defeat, need to punish, need to externalize, to blame, to frustrate the therapist, all kinds of that stuff. And, by getting into an external battle with you, they can avoid really grappling with themselves. Okay. And then they can dismiss you and say, oh, another lousy therapist, rather than really looking at their contribution. And so that's an attitude I really try to come back to again and again. And, for me, that's one of the reasons that I value the head-on collisions so much, and the spirit of them, because so much about them is deactivating and basically saying, hey, I really want to help you and I'm going to do everything I can. But at the end of the day, this is your life. And if you need to defeat me, then you can do that. I don't see how that's going to serve you, but I can't help you then if you want to defeat. And you mean it. That's the thing, is like, if we want it too much and we want to help them more than they want to get helped, oh man, you got a problem on your hands. Thanks, Robert. Other questions or thoughts or?
Maybe it will be interesting to hear from people about the things that they wrote before your talk, and how it is, restructuring. Maybe, hopefully. Yeah. What are the takes? What is different for you from from what is Jonathan? Because he is highlighting a lot, and I'm sorry for the challenge. It was a big challenge about the topic, but it came up great. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so anyone talk, there are plenty of great questions that you guys asked, so here's the time to voice them and we can get into it.
Can we look at our question regarding the case as well, the corporate lawyer?
Anything. It's a free-for-all.
Well, what I would like to hear you talk about is in the corporate lawyer, Davenlu really exhausts the transference resistance before going into the content of the current relationships. So he seems to pay a lot more attention on the closeness with the therapist than talking about what might have brought the client in therapy in the first place. And I was wondering if that could be dangerous for the alliance when you're not really answering to the client's first concern, but actually talking about the therapeutic relationship instead.
But I think he started in the scene.
But it doesn't last long before he gets into the T, I think.
Well,
to me, it seemed like, he was
it's fast.
going to the T very fast.
Okay. So let me try to answer the question, and then, even beyond the case too. But yeah, so I think what he's doing in the case is he starts in the C, and I actually think he's kind of staying hunkered down with her for quite a while in the C. But what he's doing is she has some elements that are syntonic. One of the areas of syntonicity that he's noticing is that the resistance against emotional closeness. So when you have some syntonic resistance, especially resistance against emotional closeness, you've got to pace yourself with it. And, so what you see him tend to do with cases like this is he'll kind of start to say something about it, apply a little pressure. So from the beginning, it's like, and you smile when you say that. And then she said, oh, for no reason, you smile. So for no reason, you're smiling here with me. But then he kind of lets her escape. He lets her continue on, right? Because there's some syntonicity. And then later again, he says, and again, you're avoiding my eyes. But this is like a few pages later. You avoid but what do you feel when you avoid my eyes? And nothing particular. Anyway, so nothing particular, you're avoiding my eyes. So, he's not totally holding her to looking at it all at once. Which is what you do with syntonicity. It's a graded approach. You're doing restructure, you're kind of touching on it, especially the resistance against emotional closeness. But you can't ignore it. Part of one of the cornerstones of the technique is maximizing the transference component of the resistance. That's part of what Davenlu says is what you're supposed to be doing in Istdp, especially with a kind of, resistant psychoneurotic patient like this. So, he's working in the C as much as he can, but absolutely he's going into the T. And there's an attempt to draw it out into the T. And let me give you an example. So actually, when we were talking about earlier about how he's dealing with the helplessness, where he says, which he's saying, I don't know. So he doesn't say, if you continue to, be incapable. He says, if you continue here with me to be incapable. And that's really important. Here with me. He's emphasizing the relational component of her incapability. He's drawing attention to that this is a characterological defensive attitude of hers that she is bringing in relationship to Davenlu. He wants to draw it out in the T. He wants it to come there because that's a major aspect of Istdp metapsychology is that the more that you can draw, enhance the transference component of the resistance, the more you can get character change, the more you can, really turn the patient against all their defenses, the more you're able to use our most powerful interventions, challenge and head-on collision, really turn the patient and get the biggest breakthroughs into the unconscious. So there is a purpose to that. But you have a question. Can it be dangerous? Well, it could. I think this is one of the things about Istdp. It strikes me that, and now I think about Patricia always said this too, that it's a high risk, high reward type of therapy. Okay. We walk the razor's edge in this treatment. So if you do it, if you don't have the alliance in place, you can get a misalliance pretty quick. But if you do it right, there's very little that's as powerful.
It's like we are both taking a risk. Like I heard you say many times, like put your legs in the fire. So yeah. So we both are doing it. We are doing it, because we are like saying what we see. Like there is a question about the smile, so comment about the smile and also be flexible about it, because as you said, so he can let it go if it's the first time. So he can just say, I see it and let it go, not doing anything, but come back to it later. So then it's getting more complex.
Absolutely. And the other thing is, look, it's always hard to tell from a transcript compared to like a video, but the way that the case is described, my impression is that this woman is being very avoidant of him and very, very clearly trying to mask her feelings, as she says. So there's a major transference component that gets activated early on. So if he doesn't talk about that, he's ignoring her, right. which is exactly what her parents did. They ignored her.
Okay, so then that's where you link the triangle of persons. Okay, I see now. Thank you.
Okay, so she has issues around closeness because, as she says, all she's known about closeness is pain and disappointment. Okay, closeness has been very traumatic and painful for her. So she avoids it like the plague. Okay, so then if he ignores it too, yeah, they're talking about her anger towards her boss, but they're not going to get anywhere because she's not really in the room with him. She's somewhere else. So, of all the resistances, one that you really don't want to give any shelter to is the resistance against emotional closeness. That is a resistance that I'll never give shelter to if someone is avoiding eye contact and this, because you don't have a patient at that point.
And this is so important what you said about the enactment, because a lot of the time we are afraid to get into enactment, but actually, and then we hold back. But actually, a lot of the times, this is the enactment when we are holding back, because this is the detached parent. So we need to, of course, be careful with that. But also we need to be careful not to hold back like too much, because this is also can be enactment. Again, complex, but both sides of the coin.
Yeah. There's a question in the chat from Frederick. He says, I have a question about the case. Why does Domino keep pointing out to the patient when she smiles? What is he trying to achieve by this? Is the smile just a way of distancing, or are there other reasons he points out? Yeah, no, I think you got it. You hit the nail on the head. It's a way of distancing and covering up. So, that's when you see. So Davin was very clear. The nonverbals are of enormous importance. And this is another thing that I try to work with my trainees on, because I don't see people doing it enough. It's like, what is that Bessel van der Kolk book, The Body Keeps the Score? The body is a major avenue for how the unconscious speaks. So, the body is often doing one thing and the words are doing another thing. So you point out the nonverbals as a way of showing how the patient's body is betraying them, that it is betraying their unconscious, that they're saying A and their body is saying B. So that heightens the intrapsychic conflict, because they see not between you and them, but between them and them are in conflict and are going two different directions. Now, obviously, she's talking about things that are painful, angering. Anger and pain and smile don't go together. So there's an incongruity there. So it's absolutely a mechanism for distancing. Now, the other thing that smile can be, and I think this is kind of off topic, but just to let you know, sometimes you see people smile and it has a slightly different flavor to it, because sometimes people take gratification when they're angry, or they take gratification when they're defying you or defeating you, and they're smiling, but it's not a cover-up. It's actually because there's a part of them that is loving, frustrating you. And so you don't want to be too quick to interpret. So what I do, and he does this too, is so first you call it out and you're smiling, but then very quickly you often follow it up with, well, how do you understand the smile? Is it a smile of pleasure? No. So then what's it a smile of? What's there to smile about? Right? Now there's pressure in there. You're pressuring the defense, and you're trying to get them to bring greater conscious awareness to what they're doing. And people will try to wiggle out. Oh, well, I'm smiling because I don't understand it. Okay, so you don't understand it, but what's there to smile about not understanding? Right? You don't just go along with their non-answer. You continue to apply pressure on the defense. So that would be, but things like smiles, they're always tied also into the resistance against emotional closeness, because they're for someone else. Someone might sit around in their room thinking about something painful and intellectualize about it or ruminate about it, but they're not sitting around smiling. The smile is interpersonal. It's for you. It's a cover-up of some kind. Right. So that's the other aspect of it that you want to draw out, is the interpersonal aspect. Okay, other questions or thoughts about the case or anything else? And we have about we have exactly 14 minutes left. So
something about the smile was really interesting when you comment that there is a component of positive feelings with the smile, but also avoidance, and this is also goes the pressure on the resistance. So also so this was also interesting.
Well, right. Well, and I think actually the big piece of it too was the eye avoidance is also about closeness, and closeness is also about positivity. All right. So we tend to think, oh, they're avoiding our eyes because they're angry. No, not necessarily. Eye avoidance is about connection, and there's always going to be a positive side to it too. And we don't want to ignore that. People resist their positive feelings oftentimes just as vehemently as they do their negative feelings. Julie, you have another question?
Always.
Okay.
I don't know if the others have found the same as me, but I found there was very little appeal to Will in the transcript, very little clarification of the cost of defenses. And I was a little bit taken aback by that. That Bevan alluded to me very little of that. Is that something that he did often?
Yeah, I mean, look, one is I think it's fine to disagree, and I think it's fine to say you would do it differently. And I don't think you're ever going to go wrong by checking in on Will and doing more to enhance Will. So I think that's great, and I support your freedom to say that Dominic do it as well, as we might have done it. But also, look, the transcripts are redacted, so there's also a question of exactly what was cut. And, the major aspects of where he's doing Will work is with the head-on collisions, and he's really kind of saying, look, we don't have to, you have a problem, right? Unless you're here because your husband wants you to be. No, I have a problem. So, okay, so let's face it, you have problems, and you're here because with the help of each other, we're going to do something to overcome your problems. But if you put a wall up, then we're not going to be able to do anything effective. So, that is applying pressure to her will. But I agree, he could have drawn it out maybe even more,
Yeah, I just wanted to say I agree too. I was thinking about one part, or I just that is that I experienced her as kind of with him, though, in terms of saying things like little whispers from the UTA there, but this is something I do, I hold back or I don't share. So I'm thinking he kind of, my thought was that he was maybe not explicitly asking, would you like to, look at this? Rather, he was just taking those kind of whispers as the conscious alliance really building up.
Yeah, I think so, right? And so, and he could have done something like that. He could have asked, more explicitly. My guess is in the absence of more information, he was reading also a lot of visual cues and things that, maybe we don't have access to, but yeah, I don't think you're going to go wrong by checking in on someone with whether they really want to do it. I think what you always want to remember is most people are going to tell you, yes, I want to. And that doesn't necessarily mean they really want to. So that's the only caveat with that. But yeah, it's a good point. Robert?
Questions or thoughts? One is that some people talk about a lot of the non-verbals as tactical defenses.
Tactical, yeah.
Yeah, and so to not emphasize attention to them significantly, and they often go away, quote. But you're pointing out attention to so-called tacticals, the smile, the eyes, the whatever, perhaps body positions. Yeah. So
yeah, great question. And in a way, if there's another YouTube talk I gave an interview to Mikkel. It's on YouTube. I think that's going to be announced on the listserv tomorrow or something, where I talk a lot about Davinlu's Istdp. And so I won't go into it too much, but just to say there's a lot of different styles of Istdp out there. And I am aware that some of them say, don't touch the tacticals or don't touch the tacticals until a certain level of rise, et cetera, et cetera. That's not what Davinlu did. And it's not what I do. If you read the transcripts, you see from the beginning, he's on the tacticals. And the thinking is that the tacticals are the gateway to the entire system of resistance. You put pressure on the tacticals from the beginning. That draws out the major resistance. And oftentimes, many of the tacticals don't just go away because they're getting fueled by the major resistance. So, that's what you see, again, just, how many of you guys have worked with a patient where you pointed out eye avoidance, but it keeps coming back? Or and so that or you pointed out a smile and they keep doing it. So that tells you that those tacticals are rooted in the more major resistance, but you're only going to get to the major resistance by first applying pressure on the tacticals. So I'm not sure where that kind of thinking comes from, but it's different than what Davinlu really was doing. Especially, and then just to say as a caveat, people have pointed out that Davinlu had many phases of his career, but I'm really talking about what I would say is kind of his mature or golden phase from the two books, basically, which are all the articles that he published in the journal. So from the early 80s to the mid 90s. Yeah.
Julie.
Okay. Why would he choose a
Julie, nice seeing you here.
So why would he choose a partial unlocking? He seems to really decide what kind of unlocking it's going to be ahead of time versus a complete unlocking. It seems to me like, how do you do that? Choose in the first place? And why would you even choose for the partial when you could go for the complete?
Okay, great question. So what Davinlu says in the articles is the protocol that was established, because he was working at a clinic. He wasn't working in private practice. He was working in a hospital-based clinic. And so what he says is, these people as part of a research on this method, and that it was predetermined, that they'd have to go on a waiting list afterwards. for example. And if they have to go on a waiting list, you shouldn't kind of open up their unconscious and then not see them for 2 months. So, instead do a partial. So that's what he says. Is that true? I don't know. Is he just saying that because he thinks a partial unlocking isn't as good as a major unlocking and he doesn't want to admit that? I don't know. I know there's a lot of different thoughts about it, but that's what he says. What I'll say about this issue, though, is this, that in all of the work from that period, at least that was published in that period, almost all of it, he's getting partials before majors. And I think that is purposeful because he really thought that getting to grief first lubricates the unconscious. So, and that's the term he used, that it lubricates the unconscious. So if you try to get to rage is the first breakthrough, and guilt, that's harder. And oftentimes, again, because of what I was saying about how common elements of syntonicity are, you want to get a breakthrough into grief about the cost of defenses because that motivates people to do the even harder work of getting to guilt. A lot of people, especially if they have character defenses, they don't have a lot of access to pain, right? They're so kind of cemented shut. So pain is the motivator to do this work. If you don't have access to pain, you're not going to want to do the heavy lifting of this. So getting to pain is often very helpful in doing the more arduous work of getting to guilt. The other thing is, not everyone has massive amounts of guilt and rage. A lot of people have just pain-based feelings, grief-based feelings, pathological mourning, one or more losses.
Like the case, yeah.
Like the case. And just getting to that is like super important in healing. Yeah.
Michael.
Yeah, during our supervision, we talked a little bit about projection and how to deal with that as a defense. And I know you deal with it a little bit different than others. Can you elaborate a little bit on
that? Sure. Well, yep. So this is something I'll go into depth about or with my colleagues, co-authors in the book. And, we have 3 or 4 minutes left, so probably not enough time to deal with it all. Well, definitely not. I mean, first of all, there's the question of the psychodiagnosis of the patient. So all patients can project. Patients who are psychoneurotic, and we call that little p projection, right? Versus, patients who are more fragile, who call that big P projection. I don't know about differences, so I can't speak to that. I can just tell you what I do. I think a major aspect of projection, obviously, is deactivating. So getting person to, see that there's some sort of projection at work, but also getting them to see that it's a defense. Projection is a defense. And that's kind of a central aspect in how to work with it, that it's part of the resistance. It's part of the way they're disowning and disavowing their feelings. Now, oftentimes, when I'm working with someone, and they come in with a projection, that maybe I'm going to be judgmental, I'll quickly, get them to see that this comes from them. But then I'm going to really press them to look at the fact that this is how they deal with their negative feelings. And if they see me as judgmental, must be that they're sitting on a negative feeling towards me. How could it not? How could they sit here with me, think I'm going to be judgmental towards them and not have a negative feeling? And then, of course, they'll try to wiggle out often, right? And then again, it's too complex to get into the whole thing. You might work in the C a little bit. Do you do that with other people? Who else are you with you're sitting with and you think they're judging you? My boss. So with your boss, you think your boss is judging you. Oh yeah, well, actually sometimes he is judging. Yeah. And how do you feel with him? Oh, I'm angry. Okay. So you're angry with your boss, but then you're going to tell me that you're sitting in front of me right now. And the idea is that I'll be judgmental with you, but you don't have an angry feeling. How is that possible? So you get them to see that they're hiding behind the defensive projection. Again, that I would do it differently with someone who's fragile, for example, that you'd have to work up to that. But with someone who's, highly resistant and psychoneurotic, that might be it. So, lots of deactivation, clarification that it's a defense, and then applying pressure on the defense. If they really aren't giving it up, you might see, so you're sitting here with me and you're anxious and afraid. And the idea is that I'm going to be the critical father to you. Okay. If we're not able to get past that, how in the world are we going to join up meaningfully as a team and really look at your emotional life if you're not able to get past this? So there's a little head-on collision in that. Okay. And then, you see what they do with that. So there's all kinds of different things that you might do, but you've got to deal with it as a defense. But obviously, look, if they're fragile, you do something different and stuff. So, but that's beyond this talk.
Okay.
It's so fun. I could easily do this for another hour or two, but I have to go.
Thank you so much. It was great, Jonathan. Thank you so much. Really, really rich, very clear, a lot of information, and making a lot of sense. Thank you, and thank everybody.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Thank you, especially everyone who asked questions. It was great.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you.
Thanks.
See you soon.
Bye. See you soon.
See you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.